It was a typical Wednesday afternoon in room 207, the last period before school let out for the day. The sound of shifting chairs, the rustle of notebooks, and the low murmur of whispers filled the air, creating an atmosphere of anticipation. Ariana Brooks, sitting at the far end of the piano bench, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't nervous about playing, she was terrified of the judgment that awaited her. Ariana was no stranger to silence, but this time, the silence in the room felt different. The air seemed to buzz with an unspoken tension. She could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her as she adjusted her hands on the piano keys. It was as if the entire room had collectively held its breath. She could already hear the distant giggle of Grace, the popular girl, who was always so perfect, always so poised. Grace had made it clear from day one that she wasn't impressed by Ariana's skills, or lack thereof. "All right, Ariana," Ms. Price, the new piano teacher, called from the front of the room, her tone dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm. "Let's see what you've got." Ariana's palms grew slick with sweat, her fingers trembling as she placed them lightly on the keys. She tried to steady her breath, but her chest tightened. It had been so long since she had played in front of people, and the thought of making a fool of herself in front of the class was unbearable. The piano keys stared back at her like an old, familiar enemy. The silence in the room pressed in, louder than any sound could have been. It was the kind of silence that made you second-guess every movement, every choice you made. But Ariana couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. She had to play. She had to show them she wasn't what they thought she was. With a deep breath, Ariana began to play a simple piece, Clair de Lune, by Debussy. It was one of the songs her late mother had taught her, a piece she loved, one that brought memories of quiet nights filled with the soothing sound of her mother's music. But the moment her fingers touched the keys, everything felt wrong. Her hands were stiff. Her body tense. The music wasn't flowing as it used to. It was as if every note she played was one step closer to failure. She stumbled, hitting a discordant chord that echoed throughout the room. A few of her classmates snickered. Ms. Price's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms, leaning back against her desk. The look on her face was one of disappointment, but not just disappointment, it was the kind of judgment that made Ariana feel small, insignificant. "Really, Ariana?" Ms. Price's voice was sharp, cutting through the air. "You're playing like that, and you expect to impress anyone?" Ariana's heart dropped. She tried to recover, but the damage was done. The embarrassment burned hot in her cheeks. Every mistake felt like 1,000 eyes were judging her, and she couldn't hide from them. The snickers grew louder, and the tension in the room thickened. "I'm sorry, Ms. Price," Ariana muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Price didn't respond immediately. Instead, she clicked her tongue and tapped her foot impatiently. "Maybe this isn't the right class for you," she said, her words sharp and dismissive. "Why don't you stick to something more fitting? Like math, or something less challenging?" Ariana's chest tightened. She wanted to say something, anything. But she couldn't find her voice. Instead, she dropped her hands from the keys, stood up from the bench, and walked quickly to the back of the room, avoiding the gazes of her classmates. The laughter and mocking whispers followed her as she sat in the corner, her heart sinking lower with each passing second. She wanted to disappear. The humiliation was suffocating. She wanted to curl up and never face anyone again. But deep down, something flickered, a spark, a tiny sliver of defiance. What if I just quit? The thought crossed her mind, tempting in its simplicity. If she just gave up, she wouldn't have to endure the embarrassment anymore. No more mistakes, no more judgment. She could walk away from the ridicule and never have to face it again. But then she thought of her mother. Ariana's mind drifted back to the time when she was younger, when her mother had sat beside her at the piano, guiding her small hands over the keys. The music had always been their bond, their shared space where nothing else mattered. Her mother had always believed in her. "I'm not going to quit," Ariana whispered to herself, her eyes narrowing with resolve. I'll show them. She glanced up, catching a glimpse of Ms. Price, who was still scribbling something on her clipboard, oblivious to the storm of emotions churning within Ariana. Her classmates had mostly turned their attention elsewhere, leaving Ariana alone with her thoughts. I'm going to prove them wrong, she promised herself, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She wasn't going to let Ms. Price's words define her. She wasn't going to let the mockery of the class control her future. Ariana had always loved music, it was her escape, her passion, the one thing that made her feel alive. And she wouldn't let anyone take that from her, not even Ms. Price. Ariana glanced at the clock. There were only a few minutes left before the bell rang, signaling the end of the class. Her mind raced with possibilities. There had to be a way to get better. There had to be a way to show everyone, especially Ms. Price, that she had more to offer than they thought. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, she thought, imagining the words spoken by a voice in her head. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew one thing for certain, she wasn't going to let today define her. Not this moment. She would rise above it. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, Ariana stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out of the room. The hallway outside felt colder, but she didn't care. The journey had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The walk home was always a solitary one for Ariana. The rhythmic sound of her footsteps echoed on the pavement as she made her way through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. She passed houses she'd walked by 1,000 times, each one a small marker in her life. Yet today, the path seemed different, longer, emptier. She couldn't shake off the sting of Ms. Price's words, or the echo of laughter that had followed her out of the classroom. The day had started so promisingly, but now she was left with nothing but a growing sense of doubt. Ariana had always been the quiet girl, the one who preferred to sit in the back of the room and keep to herself. Her classmates were loud, full of energy, and confident, everything Ariana wasn't. She didn't mind most days, she liked her space. But moments like today, when the world seemed to turn against her, were harder to navigate. She had always loved music, but it hadn't always been easy to embrace. It started with her mother. Ariana's earliest memories were of sitting beside her mother at the piano, watching her fingers dance over the keys. Music was something they shared, a secret language only they spoke. Her mother, Evelyn Brooks, was a talented pianist, known in their small community for her beautiful playing. But it wasn't just her mother's musical talent that made her special. It was her warmth, her ability to make Ariana feel safe and loved. When Ariana was a little girl, she would sit beside her mother and trace the patterns her fingers made on the ivory keys. Music is the voice of your soul, sweet girl, her mother had told her once, the sound of her voice gentle and full of love. Ariana remembered the way her mother's eyes sparkled when she played. It wasn't just the technical mastery of the music, it was the way the notes seemed to flow from her heart, the way she brought every piece to life. Ariana had always wanted to play like that. But her mother's untimely death when Ariana was just 12 left a void in her life that nothing could fill. Her mother's music had been a lifeline for Ariana, a way to connect with her even after she was gone. But when Evelyn passed away, everything became harder. Music became bittersweet. The piano in their home, which had once been a symbol of love and joy, now stood in the corner, gathering dust. Ariana found it difficult to bring herself to play, knowing that each note would be a reminder of her loss. Her father, Mr. Brooks, had been supportive in his own way. He'd never questioned Ariana's love for music, but he also didn't fully understand it. He worked long hours at his job, leaving Ariana to fend for herself most of the time. His idea of support came in the form of paying for her lessons, but that was about it. They didn't talk about her music much, and Ariana never pushed him to. She didn't want to make him uncomfortable, especially since he was already so consumed by his own grief. But the silence in their home after her mother's death was deafening. Mr. Brooks buried himself in work, often coming home late, leaving Ariana to face her emotions alone. She didn't blame him, she knew he was just as lost without her mother as she was. Still, there was a loneliness that clung to her, a feeling of isolation that she couldn't escape. Ariana's relationship with music had always been complicated. It was a reminder of all she had lost, but it was also a bridge to the past, to the part of her life that had felt whole. As she walked through the streets, the weight of that connection felt heavier than ever. At school, her love for the piano was something she kept mostly to herself. Her classmates, like Grace, were better at things than she was. Grace had it all, the talent, the confidence, the social grace. She was the kind of person who could charm anyone into thinking she was the most talented, the most brilliant. And while Ariana admired Grace's skill, she couldn't help but feel a sense of insecurity whenever she compared herself to her. Grace's piano skills were undeniable. She played with a precision that Ariana could never seem to match. She was the one everyone in the class turned to for help, the one Miss Price always praised. Ariana often felt like an afterthought, the one who never quite got it right, the one who had to work harder than everyone else to keep up. But Ariana wasn't a quitter. She couldn't be. Not after everything she had been through. Not after losing her mother, and not after finding solace in the music she had learned from her. Music was the one thing that had always been there for her, even when everything else fell apart. As Ariana reached her house, she stopped for a moment and stared at the worn steps leading up to the door. The house was small, modest, but it was hers. She could see the dim light flickering inside, the faint sound of the television playing from the living room. Her father would be home soon, if he wasn't already there. Ariana took a deep breath and entered the house. She tossed her backpack on the couch and walked past the kitchen, where the smell of something cooking lingered in the air. She wasn't sure if it was something her father had made or if he had just reheated leftovers. It didn't matter. She made her way to the living room, where her father sat with his head buried in a newspaper. He didn't look up as she entered. "Hey, Dad," she said quietly, standing by the doorway. He glanced up from the paper, his eyes tired. "Hey, kiddo. How was school?" "Fine," Ariana answered, even though it was far from fine. She didn't feel like talking about Ms. Price's cruel words, or how she'd almost felt like quitting the piano altogether. Her dad wouldn't understand. Mr. Brooks smiled faintly. "You still practicing the piano?" Ariana nodded. "Yeah. I'll be in my room in a bit." "Good," he said, a little too distracted to really focus on her answer. "Keep it up." She gave him a half-hearted smile before heading upstairs. As she opened the door to her room, she saw the piano sitting quietly in the corner. It had always been her mother's, and every time she touched the keys, it felt like her mother's spirit was still with her, guiding her. She sat down and ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not playing anything in particular, just letting her hands move. The familiar sound filled the room, soothing her for a moment. But as she closed her eyes and imagined her mother's hands on the keys, the memory was bittersweet. "I'm not going to give up," Ariana whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "I'll make you proud, Mom." She wasn't sure how, but she would find a way. She couldn't let Ms. Price's words break her, and she couldn't let her fears stop her from chasing the one thing that had always brought her peace. It was time to get better. It was time to show everyone, including herself, what she was really capable of. Tomorrow, she would start again. The following morning, Ariana woke up early. The light streaming in through her window was soft and muted, the sun just beginning to climb over the horizon. She pulled the blanket off herself and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the piano across the room. There it was, sitting quietly, as if waiting for her to finally return to it. Her mother's piano. It had been a part of her life for so long, a connection to the past, and yet now it seemed like an obstacle she wasn't sure how to overcome. Yesterday's humiliation at school lingered in her mind. The smirks of her classmates, the sharp tone of Ms. Price, and the crushing silence that had filled the room during her performance. Each of those moments replayed in her mind like a broken record, the words that had stung echoing in her ears. Maybe this isn't the right class for you. Ariana shook her head. No. She wouldn't let that define her. She couldn't. But the reality was, she didn't feel ready to face the piano again. It felt as though it had betrayed her yesterday, just like the rest of the world had. But she had made a promise to herself, hadn't she? I'm not going to quit. Ariana stood up, feeling the weight of that promise on her shoulders. She could hear the sound of her father moving around downstairs, preparing for another long day at work. He had no idea what she was going through, but he had always encouraged her to keep playing. It was one of the few things they could bond over. She grabbed her robe and walked to the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her dad was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone, his back turned to her. He didn't even notice her standing in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, watching him, before speaking softly. Hey, Dad, I'm going to play today. He turned around, giving her a tired smile. That's good to hear. You should. Music's in your blood, right? She nodded, but the words in your blood felt foreign, almost too heavy for her. Did she really have it in her to keep going? I'll try, she said quietly. Thanks. Ariana didn't wait for a response, and she headed upstairs to her room. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment, just looking at the piano again. This time, it didn't seem so welcoming. It seemed like a mountain, and Ariana wasn't sure she could climb it. But she had to. Her fingers moved toward the keys, but for a long moment, they hovered above the surface. The memories of yesterday, the fear, the doubts, the whispers of failure, held her in place. But then she closed her eyes and let herself remember her mother. Her mother's soft smile as she played, the warmth in her touch, the music that had always flowed from her effortlessly. Ariana had to find that connection again. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hands on the piano keys, letting them rest there for a moment, feeling the coolness of the ivory beneath her fingertips. It felt like a reminder of something that once felt so right. Slowly, she began to play. Her fingers found their place on the keys, and she started to play the opening chords of Clair de Lune once more. This time, she tried to let the music flow freely, just as her mother had taught her. But the more she played, the more mistakes she made. The familiar melody turned into a series of stumbles and false notes. Her body stiffened again, and her fingers seemed to betray her, tripping over each other as if they had forgotten the movements. Ariana stopped, frustrated. She slammed her hand on the keys, causing a jarring discord to ring out through the room. She could feel the tears threatening to fall, but she quickly wiped them away before they had a chance to gather. You're not weak. You're not weak, she told herself. But her voice inside trembled, her resolve shaking with the uncertainty she felt. Her mind drifted back to her first piano lessons with her mother. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, her mother had said once. It's through the mistakes that you find your sound. But it didn't feel that way now. It felt like the mistakes were all she had left, and the sound of the music, the sound she loved, had deserted her. Knock. Knock. Ariana jerked her head toward the door, startled by the sound. She had been so lost in her thoughts that she hadn't heard her father approach. The door creaked open slightly. You all right, kiddo? He asked softly, standing in the doorway with concern in his eyes. Ariana didn't respond right away. She felt a rush of emotions, embarrassment, frustration, loneliness. She didn't want her dad to see her like this, but she couldn't hide it anymore. I can't get it right, Dad, she said, her voice trembling. Every time I try, it's just wrong. It's not like it used to be. I feel like I'm losing everything." Mr. Brooks stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He walked over to the piano and sat down beside her, his presence calming. He didn't say anything for a moment, just let the silence hang between them. Ariana's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't look away from him. "You know, your mom had a saying," Mr. Brooks finally said, breaking the silence. "She used to tell me all the time that the best musicians aren't the ones who never mess up. They're the ones who get back up after they do. She believed in you, Ariana. And I believe in you too." Ariana felt the lump in her throat grow, but she swallowed it down. She turned to look at her dad, her eyes searching his face for some sign of understanding. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "You don't have to know yet," he said gently. "You just have to keep trying." His words hung in the air, and for the first time in a while, Ariana didn't feel so alone in her struggle. She felt a little lighter, as though the weight she had been carrying had shifted just a bit. "Thanks, Dad," she murmured, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. He nodded, getting up from the piano bench. "I'll be downstairs if you need me." As he left the room, Ariana sat quietly for a moment, letting his words sink in. Maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about perseverance. She turned back to the piano, her hands hovering over the keys once more. This time, she played without worrying about getting it perfect. She played to remember her mother's smile, the love they shared through the music, and the belief that she could rise above the challenges ahead. The music, though far from flawless, felt a little easier to play. And as Ariana played, she made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't going to give up. Not today. Not ever. Ariana's heart raced as she walked toward the school building the next morning. Today, the air felt different, charged with anticipation, perhaps even a bit of fear. Her fingers, which had felt stiff and uncertain yesterday, had finally found some rhythm again. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, Ariana was beginning to feel like maybe she had a shot at this. She had spent hours last night at the piano, working on the same piece, refusing to stop until her hands felt steady on the keys again. Her father's words echoed in her mind as she played, "The best musicians aren't the ones who never mess up. They're the ones who get back up after they do." Ariana had played Clair de Lune until the notes flowed with a delicate grace. She could almost hear her mother's voice in the back of her mind, guiding her, telling her she was capable. It wasn't perfect, but she was starting to feel something familiar again, hope. When she arrived at school, Ariana's nerves kicked in. As she walked through the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew what had happened in Ms. Price's class the day before. She felt like eyes were following her every step, their judgments hidden behind whispered conversations. But today, she would face it. She would push through the discomfort. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. Her first class of the day was music theory. As Ariana walked into the room, she noticed Grace sitting near the front, flipping through her sheet music. Ariana hesitated for a moment but forced herself to walk to her usual seat in the back of the room. She kept her eyes down, hoping to blend into the background. Ms. Price hadn't arrived yet, so the students chatted amongst themselves, but Ariana couldn't bring herself to join in. Her thoughts were too loud, too heavy, consumed by everything that had happened and what was about to come. Just then, Grace's voice pierced the air. "Hey, Ariana," she called out with a smile. "You ready for today?" Ariana stiffened. Grace wasn't being mean, not exactly. But there was a smugness in her voice that always seemed to be there. Ariana had never quite understood Grace's need to be the center of attention, to make everything seem effortless. It was like she couldn't help but rub it in when she succeeded. "Yeah," Ariana said, her voice steady, but her hands betrayed her, clenched tight in her lap. "I'll give it my best shot." Grace raised an eyebrow, her gaze flickering to Ariana's tense posture. "Well, if you need any tips, you know where to find me." She smiled, a little too brightly. Ariana nodded, the words from the day before ringing in her ears. She felt a flicker of resentment toward Grace, but she pushed it aside. Today wasn't about Grace. It was about her. It was about proving to herself that she could do it. Ms. Price entered the room just then, her presence immediately commanding attention. She walked to the front of the class and set her materials down on the podium with a quiet authority. There was no greeting, no pleasantries. She simply got straight to business. "All right, everyone," Ms. Price began, "today's lesson will focus on musical interpretation. How we can bring life to a piece, beyond the notes on the page. You'll each be performing a piece of your choice at the end of class, as usual. I expect to hear some improvement." Ariana swallowed hard. The last thing she wanted was to perform again, especially in front of Ms. Price, who had made it clear the day before that she wasn't impressed with Ariana's playing. But there was no backing out. She had to do this. For herself. She closed her eyes briefly, taking in a deep breath, trying to center herself. "Just keep going, Ariana. You've got this." Ms. Price continued to call on the other students, and Ariana found herself dreading the moment when her name would be called. Grace went first, naturally. She played a flawless piece, a classical piece Ariana had always admired. Her fingers moved over the keys with precision, creating a sound so beautiful it nearly brought tears to Ariana's eyes. The class was visibly impressed, as expected. Grace gave a little smirk when she finished, and the applause was immediate. Ariana tried to focus on her breathing, trying to calm the nerves that were building in her chest. She had practiced Clair de Lune for hours, and while it wasn't perfect, it felt like a part of her again. This was her chance to take the first step toward redemption, to reclaim the music she loved. She wouldn't let Ms. Price or anyone else steal that from her. "All right, Ariana," Ms. Price's voice cut through the tension, cold and distant. "It's your turn." Ariana stood, her hands clammy as she made her way to the piano. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to move forward, telling herself that this was what she had to do. She couldn't let fear hold her back anymore. As she sat at the piano, Ariana let her fingers rest lightly on the keys. She closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the room, the judgment, the expectations. This wasn't about anyone else. This was about her. She began to play. At first, the notes were shaky, tentative. Her fingers stumbled just like they had the night before, but she kept playing, pushing through the uncertainty. The melody began to take shape, each note gaining more confidence, the music beginning to flow. Ariana focused entirely on the music, her breath steadying as she played. It wasn't perfect. She missed a few notes here and there, and her timing was off in places, but there was something new in her playing. There was a sense of heart, of emotion, that hadn't been there before. She was playing not for anyone else but for herself, for the memory of her mother, and for the promise she had made to never give up. When she finished, there was a long silence in the room. Ariana's hands rested on the keys, her fingers aching from the effort. She opened her eyes and looked around, her heart in her throat. She was waiting for the inevitable. The judgment. Ms. Price was staring at her, her face unreadable. The class was silent, too, not sure what to make of the performance. Ariana could feel the weight of the moment, her stomach churning with anxiety. And then, finally, Ms. Price spoke. "That was, not bad," she said, her tone still cool, but there was something in her voice that Ariana couldn't quite place. "You've got a lot of room for improvement, but I can see that you're trying. That's what matters." Ariana's breath caught in her throat. Was that praise? Not bad wasn't exactly a glowing review, but it wasn't the criticism she had expected, either. She looked around at her classmates. Grace was staring at her, her mouth slightly open in surprise. Ariana couldn't help but feel a small flicker of triumph. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ariana smiled to herself, quietly proud. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And progress, she reminded herself, was all that mattered. She was taking her first step. And that was the beginning of something much bigger than just a song. Ariana couldn't shake the feeling of triumph as she walked home that afternoon. Ms. Price's comment had been a small victory, but it felt huge to Ariana. It wasn't just about the music, though. It was about proving to herself that she wasn't going to let one bad moment, or 100 bad moments, define her. The whole day had been a shift, a change in how she viewed her place in the world and her own potential. As she walked through the front door of her house, she felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. The familiar smell of her father's cooking filled the air, and she could hear him humming to himself in the kitchen. Everything felt normal again. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. She kicked off her shoes and headed toward the kitchen, where her dad was stirring something on the stove. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice light, almost carefree. "I did it." Her dad turned around, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean, did it?" "I played," she said, grinning. "In class. And Ms. Price didn't completely destroy me this time." Her dad's face broke into a wide smile. "That's great, sweetheart. I knew you could do it. You've got that fire in you. I can see it." Ariana felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It was the first time in days that she had allowed herself to feel hopeful. He hadn't seen her perform yet, but the fact that he was proud of her, regardless of the outcome, made all the difference. But there was something else on her mind, something she couldn't shake. A part of her still couldn't forget the way the students in her class had reacted. The way Grace had watched her like a hawk, her smile almost predatory. Ariana could still feel the weight of her gaze, the judgment, even if Grace hadn't said anything. It was enough to make her question herself, to doubt whether she truly belonged. As the evening passed, Ariana sat at the piano again, her fingers idly running over the keys. She wasn't playing a piece, just letting her mind wander. But something kept tugging at her heart, the feeling that the acceptance she'd felt in class was fleeting. What if it wasn't enough? The thought hit her with surprising force. What if, no matter how much effort she put in, it would never be enough? What if she was destined to always fall short, to always be the girl who couldn't quite measure up? Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wasn't going to let herself fall into that trap again. She had come so far already. She had taken the first step, and that was more than enough. She wasn't alone in this journey. Her father believed in her. And her mother had always believed in her. Ariana's mind drifted back to her mother. Her face, always so calm and peaceful as she played. Her hands moving gracefully over the keys, creating melodies that seemed to flow from her like magic. Her mother had been her biggest supporter, even when Ariana doubted herself. "I can do this for you," Ariana thought, her fingers finding the familiar keys of Clair de Lune. "I can do this for myself." Her hands moved with purpose this time, the melody flowing from her fingertips more smoothly than it had in days. It wasn't perfect, but it was good. She let herself feel the music, just like her mother had taught her. Suddenly, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke her concentration. Ariana glanced up, frowning. Her dad had already gone to bed for the night. It couldn't be him. The door to the house creaked open, and Ariana's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the voice that followed. "Ariana?" It was Ms. Price. Confused, Ariana stood up from the piano and walked to the door. Sure enough, standing in the doorway was her music teacher, Ms. Price, wearing her usual neutral expression but with something else behind her eyes. A hint of something different. "Ms. Price?" Ariana asked, her voice trembling slightly. I know this might seem strange, Ms. Price said, her tone softer than usual, but I wanted to speak to you. In person. Ariana didn't know what to say. She glanced back at the piano, then back to her teacher. What about? I came to apologize, Ms. Price said, her voice steady, but the apology was there, undeniable in the way her gaze softened. I've been tough on you. Too tough. I don't know what happened in that moment yesterday, but I lost sight of what's important. Ariana's heart pounded. She wasn't sure if she could believe it. Ms. Price had been so dismissive, so cold to her the day before. To have her standing here, apologizing, was unexpected. But at the same time, it felt like something had shifted. Something important. I didn't mean to make you feel like you weren't good enough, Ms. Price continued, her voice low. You've got talent, Ariana. More than most students I've taught. But I wasn't seeing that yesterday. I was too focused on perfection. Ariana swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Ms. Price took a step forward, her eyes locking onto Ariana's. What I didn't realize, she said quietly, is that perfection isn't what makes music meaningful. It's the heart behind it. And you've got that. Ariana blinked, processing the words. Her mind raced. Was this really happening? Ms. Price had never shown her this side before. It felt surreal. Thank you, Ariana finally managed to say, her voice small but strong. I needed to hear that. Ms. Price smiled, just a little, the first real smile Ariana had seen from her. You're welcome, she said. I just wanted to let you know that I see you, Ariana. And you've got a lot of potential. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ariana felt like she was floating, like she was on the edge of something huge, something that was just beginning. It was as if the weight she had been carrying had shifted, lightened, and for the first time, Ariana felt like she could breathe. Her piano sat in the corner of the room, waiting. But now, it didn't feel like an obstacle anymore. It felt like a companion, something that was going to carry her through this journey. She wasn't perfect. But maybe, just maybe, that was okay. And for the first time in a long time, Ariana knew that she was ready to face whatever came next. The week passed in a blur for Ariana. The unexpected apology from Ms. Price had lifted a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Her teacher's change in attitude, though small, had given Ariana something more valuable than just a pat on the back. It had given her a sense of validation, an affirmation that she wasn't alone in this journey. The validation didn't come from the applause of her peers or even her teacher's acknowledgement, it came from within herself. She had started to believe in her own potential. But as much as the apology had meant to her, Ariana knew that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. The road ahead still seemed long, and the challenges would only grow more intense as time went on. There was still the looming music competition to face, still the pressure of competing against Grace, and, perhaps most daunting of all, still the fragile relationship she had with her own self-doubt. But Ariana was ready to face it all. She had already taken the first step, and with each passing day, her confidence grew. She'd been practicing more, not just at home but at school during lunch breaks. She'd even started sneaking in extra practice time after classes were over, working through each piece with a dedication that she hadn't felt in months. Her friends, too, began to notice the shift. Some of them, like Emma, had known Ariana's struggles from the beginning. They had seen her at her lowest point, when she thought she couldn't go on. But now, Ariana was different. There was a fire in her eyes, a quiet strength in the way she moved, in the way she played. You're really killing it lately, Emma said one afternoon, sitting beside Ariana on the school steps after their music class. You've been practicing so much, I can barely keep up with you. Ariana smiled. I've had a lot of time to think. I'm figuring it out. Emma raised an eyebrow. Figuring out what? Everything, Ariana said with a laugh. What matters? What doesn't? And most importantly, what I need to prove to myself. Sounds like you're ready for the competition, Emma replied, nudging her friend lightly. Ariana nodded, though the words felt heavy in her chest. The competition was still on her mind, a constant reminder that everything she'd worked for would come to a head soon. She couldn't escape it, and, honestly, part of her didn't want to. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment where she could truly prove herself. Yet, despite the growing confidence in her heart, Ariana couldn't escape the doubts that still lingered. What if she wasn't enough? What if all the hours of practice, all the self-talk, still wouldn't be enough to beat Grace? After all, Grace was brilliant. Ariana had heard her play enough times to know that. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a notification from Grace. Ariana froze for a moment, unsure of whether she wanted to read the message. She wasn't sure how she felt about Grace right now. There was a tension between them, a sense that their relationship had shifted. She hesitated, then opened the message. Hey, Ariana. I heard you've been practicing hard lately. I just wanted to say good luck at the competition. I know you're working hard, and I'm actually looking forward to seeing what you can do. No hard feelings. May the best person win. Ariana stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. It was an olive branch of sorts, a gesture of kindness that she hadn't expected. And yet, it didn't feel entirely genuine. Grace had never been the type to show kindness without expecting something in return. Still, Ariana felt a flicker of gratitude. Maybe this was Grace's way of acknowledging that Ariana was a real contender. She took a deep breath before typing her reply. Thanks, Grace. I appreciate that. May the best person win. There. It was simple, direct, and a sign that Ariana was no longer caught in the web of competition. She didn't need to compare herself to Grace anymore. She didn't need anyone's approval to know she was worthy. She had already proved that to herself. As the day of the competition drew closer, Ariana felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. It was strange, but this time, the nerves didn't overwhelm her the way they used to. She wasn't paralyzed by fear or anxiety. Instead, she felt a quiet resolve deep in her bones. The night before the competition, she found herself back at the piano, playing through her pieces one last time. She had been working tirelessly, perfecting every note, every phrase. But more than that, she had been working on herself. She had learned to trust her instincts again. To play not just with her fingers, but with her heart. The sound of the piano filled the house as her father entered the room. He stopped in the doorway, watching her quietly for a moment. You're ready, kiddo, he said softly, his voice full of pride. I can tell. Ariana didn't look up immediately. She continued to play, lost in the music. I don't know. It's so hard. What if I mess up? Her father chuckled gently. I don't think you'll mess up. But even if you do, you'll get back up, just like we've talked about. You've got heart, Ariana. And that's what counts. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had heard these words before, but tonight, they resonated more deeply than ever before. She wasn't just playing for a score or a judge's approval. She was playing for herself, for the love of music, for the memory of her mother, and for the pride of knowing she had fought through every obstacle to get here. I'm proud of you, her dad said, his voice thick with emotion. No matter what happens tomorrow. Ariana finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you. As she looked at him, she realized that this moment, this quiet understanding between them, was just as important as any competition, any performance. It was the foundation of everything she had worked for, the love and support that had carried her through the hardest moments of her life. And it was the love that would continue to push her forward, no matter what happened tomorrow. The competition wasn't just about proving her worth to anyone else. It was about honoring herself, honoring the journey, and honoring the people who had believed in her all along. Tomorrow, she would play not for the judges or the audience, but for the girl who had learned to believe in herself. And that, she realized, was the most important victory of all. The morning of the competition arrived faster than Ariana had expected. Her heart raced as she walked through the crowded halls of the auditorium, the sound of chatter and nervous laughter filling the air. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Students from various schools gathered to compete for the coveted first place, each of them brimming with ambition. Ariana had never felt like she belonged in a crowd like this. She had always preferred being in the background, quietly working on her craft, but today, she wasn't just in the background. She was part of something bigger. As she entered the auditorium, the stage seemed impossibly large. The piano, a grand Steinway that gleamed under the spotlight, stood at the center, waiting for its next player. Ariana felt a knot form in her stomach as she took it all in, the judges sitting at the front, the audience members whispering excitedly to one another, and the other contestants, each one already preparing their own pieces in the practice rooms. "Are you ready, Ariana?" Emma's voice broke through the fog of nerves surrounding her. Ariana turned to find her friend standing beside her, a look of calm confidence on her face. "I don't know if I'm ready," Ariana admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I have to do this. I have to give it everything I've got." "You've already come so far," Emma said, her smile warm and reassuring. "Don't forget that." Ariana took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It wasn't about beating Grace or any of the other competitors. It was about proving to herself that she could take the stage with confidence and perform the way she knew she could. As she made her way to the backstage area, the familiar sound of Grace's voice stopped her in her tracks. Well, look who decided to show up," Grace said, her tone smooth, almost too sweet. She stood there, arms crossed, with a look of quiet superiority in her eyes. Her eyes flicked over Ariana's outfit, her stance, as if appraising her like a piece of art. "I have to say, I didn't expect you to make it this far." Ariana's stomach flipped, and she felt the sting of the words before she could stop herself. But then, something shifted. A part of her, the part she had worked so hard to build, refused to let Grace's words get to her. She straightened her back, met Grace's gaze, and let the silence hang for a moment. "I'm here because I belong here," Ariana said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I've earned it. You may think you have this competition in the bag, but I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." Grace's smile faltered just for a moment, but it quickly returned. "We'll see," she said coolly before turning away, striding confidently toward the stage. Ariana took another breath, grounding herself in the moment. She had never stood up to Grace like that before, and it felt empowering. It reminded her of everything she had gone through to get here, the self-doubt, the struggles, the hours spent practicing. It wasn't just about this moment, it was about everything that had come before. Her name was soon called, and Ariana's heart skipped a beat. It was her turn. She walked across the stage with her head held high, every step feeling heavier than the last, until she finally reached the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, her mind racing. The auditorium was silent now, the weight of the eyes on her heavy. Ariana's fingers brushed the keys lightly, as if to test the waters. Then, without thinking, she dove in. The opening chords of Clair de Lune filled the room, soft and ethereal. Ariana closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music take over. She felt the familiar rhythm of the piece, the gentle flow of the melody, and she let it carry her. It was just her and the piano now, the world outside fading away. She poured every ounce of emotion into the piece, her fingers dancing across the keys. She wasn't playing for the judges or for the audience. She was playing for herself. This was her moment to show that she had overcome everything. The long nights, the doubts, the fears, they all vanished in the sound of the music. But just as she reached the more complex section of the piece, something unexpected happened. One of the keys, just one, stuck. The sound was off, the note discordant and jarring. Ariana's heart dropped, and for a split second, everything felt like it was falling apart. But then, she remembered. This wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience. Without missing a beat, she recovered. She adjusted her fingers, finding the correct key, and continued. The music flowed again, beautiful and uninterrupted, just like she had practiced. Ariana let herself breathe and keep going. When the last note rang out, she opened her eyes, her hands still resting on the keys. The silence in the room was deafening for a moment, but then the applause began, slow at first, but quickly growing louder. She had done it. She had made it through. Ariana stood up, her heart racing. She bowed, grateful for the recognition, but it was more than that. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for. As she left the stage, she caught Emma's eye. Her friend was smiling, beaming with pride. "You did it," Emma mouthed, giving her a thumbs up. Ariana nodded, still in a daze, but the weight of the moment was starting to settle in. She had done it. She had faced her fears and walked through them. The applause didn't matter as much as the fact that she had stood on that stage and given everything she had, without hesitation. As she returned backstage, she was greeted by Ms. Price, who offered her a nod of approval. "You played beautifully, Ariana," Ms. Price said softly, her tone almost reverent. "You should be proud of yourself." Ariana smiled, feeling an unexpected wave of gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the competition passed in a blur. Ariana didn't know who won or lost, and, honestly, she didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with herself. She had faced the music, literally, and had come out stronger because of it. As the day came to an end and the awards were handed out, Ariana wasn't surprised to find that she didn't win first place. It went to Grace, as expected. But Ariana's smile was genuine as she applauded her rival. Grace had earned it, and Ariana wasn't bitter about it. She had won something far more important, something that couldn't be measured by trophies or titles. When Ariana finally made it home that evening, her father was waiting for her, his arms open wide. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice full of hope. Ariana smiled up at him, a sense of peace settling over her. "It went well, Dad. I did my best. And that's all that matters," he replied, pulling her into a warm hug. For the first time in a long while, Ariana didn't feel like she needed anything more. She had already won the most important thing, the belief in herself. And that, she knew, was the most valuable prize of all. The weeks following the competition passed by in a blur. Ariana's life seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm: school, practice, and spending time with her friends. The relief from the pressure of the competition was palpable, but it didn't last long. The lessons from the event, lessons that Ariana had never quite expected to learn, continued to unfold in subtle ways. One morning, a few days after the competition, Ariana was walking through the halls when she noticed something odd. There were whispers, murmurs, and more than a few nods in her direction. At first, she thought she was imagining it, surely people weren't talking about her. But as she walked past a group of students near her locker, she heard her name. "Ariana, she played Claire de Lune, didn't she? The girl who messed up." A rush of discomfort washed over her, but she kept walking, her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't know why hearing that bothered her so much. It wasn't the first time someone had brought up her performance, but this time felt different. It wasn't just the mistake on stage. It was the way it was framed, as if the only thing that defined her performance was that one slip-up. As she reached her locker, Emma appeared beside her, her face scrunched in concern. "I heard them talking about you," Emma said softly. "I know it's hard, but don't let it get to you. You did an amazing job out there. You didn't lose because of a mistake. Ariana didn't say anything for a moment, trying to push back the sting of her classmates' whispers. I know, she replied, her voice low. But that mistake. It felt like it overshadowed everything else. Emma shook her head. Ariana, you were amazing. You played with so much heart, and everyone saw it. The slip-up didn't take that away. You're not defined by one moment. Ariana managed a small smile. I'm trying not to be, she said, though her words lacked conviction. The truth was, she hadn't completely shaken the feeling that she had fallen short. She had been so focused on proving her worth to others that she had lost sight of what really mattered, proving it to herself. It wasn't until later that evening, after another long practice session, that Ariana truly began to process the events of the competition. She sat at the piano, her fingers brushing over the keys as she reflected on everything that had happened. She wasn't sure why she had been so fixated on that one mistake. Perhaps it was because, for so long, she had carried the weight of feeling like she wasn't good enough. She had convinced herself that a single mistake meant failure. That if she didn't play perfectly, she would be discarded as insignificant. But that couldn't be further from the truth. She had done more than just play a piece of music at the competition. She had exposed her vulnerability. She had put herself out there in front of an audience, despite all the insecurities that had once held her back. The mistake, though jarring, had been just another part of her journey, not a reflection of her worth. As the evening deepened into night, Ariana's thoughts turned inward. She realized that the mistake hadn't overshadowed her performance. What it had done was remind her that she was human. She didn't have to be flawless to be valuable. She didn't have to be perfect to make a lasting impact. Her journey hadn't been about playing the piano without error, it had been about embracing herself, flaws and all. It was about finding the courage to keep going, even when things didn't go as planned. That night, she practiced for hours, not trying to perfect the music, but simply enjoying the act of playing. Her fingers moved freely across the keys, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't focused on impressing anyone. She was playing because she loved it, because it was what made her feel alive. And that realization, simple but profound, was exactly what she needed. The following day at school, Ariana felt a change within herself. She held her head a little higher, her steps a little more confident. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. She had already proven it to herself. During lunch, Ariana sat with Emma and a few other friends, and as usual, the topic of the competition came up. Ariana, you were amazing, one of her classmates, Sarah, said. Seriously, that performance? I didn't even notice the mistake. You were incredible. Ariana smiled, grateful for the kind words. Thanks. It means a lot. Emma looked over at Ariana and nudged her gently. See? Everyone knows how great you are. Don't let the small stuff get to you. For a moment, Ariana sat back and let the warmth of her friend's support wash over her. It was a reminder that the opinions that truly mattered were the ones of the people who cared about her, not the ones who might judge her for a single moment of imperfection. But there was still something on Ariana's mind. Something deeper. That night, after dinner, Ariana went to her room, sat by her piano, and began to play again. Her fingers moved effortlessly over the keys, her mind clear and free from doubt. She thought about her mom, who had always believed in her, who had always encouraged her to push forward despite the obstacles. Ariana realized that it wasn't just her friends or her family who were cheering her on, it was her mother's memory, always with her, always pushing her to be her best. The more she played, the more she realized something important. The music had never been just about the notes or the performance. It had always been about her heart. That was the secret to it all. To playing with soul. To living with soul. She wasn't playing for the applause anymore. She wasn't competing for a prize. She was playing for herself. And that was the greatest gift she could give. The next day, she entered school with a newfound sense of peace. She was still ready to face the challenges ahead, still excited about her music, but the pressure to be perfect had melted away. The mistakes, the failures, and the moments of uncertainty had all become part of the beautiful tapestry of her journey. Ariana had already won, and that victory was hers to keep. Ariana's life was on an upward trajectory. Each day felt a little brighter, a little more hopeful. Her confidence was no longer a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single mistake. She had learned to embrace her imperfections and see them as part of her strength. Music had become more than just something she did, it was a reflection of who she was, of everything she had overcome. But even as she stood tall in her new sense of self-worth, there was still one part of her life that remained unresolved, the story of her mother. Since the competition, Ariana had spent many quiet nights at her piano, her fingers dancing over the keys in a way that felt both freeing and cathartic. Yet every time she closed her eyes to focus on her music, the image of her mother would linger in the background of her thoughts. The pain of her loss, while it had dulled, was still there, hidden in the crevices of her heart. Ariana had never fully opened up about her mother's death, not to anyone. There were moments when she thought about talking to Emma, her closest friend, or even Ms. Price, who had become a mentor of sorts, but every time she got close to saying something, the words stuck in her throat. She was afraid of revealing the raw vulnerability that still haunted her, afraid of appearing weak. It wasn't until one particularly quiet evening, as the sun began to set and the light filtered softly through the window, that the urge to confront her past became too strong to ignore. Ariana knew that she couldn't keep running from it. The memories of her mother, the laughter, the love, and the eventual heartbreak were part of who she was. If she wanted to truly heal, she had to face it head-on. Her mind drifted to the box that had been tucked away in the corner of her room for years, the box her mother had left behind. It was filled with photographs, letters, and journals. She had never opened it, never dared to look inside. The grief was too fresh when her mother passed, and the box remained untouched. But tonight, something inside her urged her to go there, to confront the past and find some answers. Ariana hesitated, her hand hovering over the box. It had been so long, and she wondered what she might find. Her mother's absence was still an aching wound, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to reopen it. But the longer she stood there, the more she realized that this was her moment. This was part of her journey, of growing, of learning, and of becoming whole again. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid and began to sift through the contents. Old photographs, some faded with age, others vibrant with memories of better days, spilled out in her hands. She carefully picked up a picture of herself as a little girl, her mother beside her, both smiling brightly. Ariana's heart tightened at the sight of her mother's face, her radiant smile that seemed so full of life. She kept digging through the box, and soon she found something unexpected, a stack of journals. Her mother's handwriting, neat and precise, was scrawled across the pages. Ariana felt a strange sense of hesitation before she opened the first one. She had never read her mother's private thoughts, never ventured into the parts of her mother's life that had been a mystery to her. Flipping the journal open, she began to read. June 16, 2008. Today was one of those days where everything felt wrong. Ariana is growing up so fast, and I wonder if I'm doing enough. I look at her, and I see so much of myself in her, the same passion for music, the same determination, the same fire. But I also see her struggles. I see her questioning herself, doubting her worth, and it breaks my heart. I hope she never feels like she's not enough. I hope she knows that I love her, no matter what. Ariana felt a lump form in her throat. Her mother had known her so well. Had always known the battles she would face, the doubts that would cloud her mind. But there was more in those pages, things Ariana hadn't realized at the time, things her mother had kept hidden, perhaps to protect her. She turned the page, and her heart began to race as the next entry caught her eye. October 1st, 2010. I've been keeping a secret. A part of me feels guilty, but another part of me knows it's the only way. The doctors say I don't have much time left. I've been trying to keep it together for Ariana, to shield her from the truth, but I don't think I can do it for much longer. I'm scared. I'm so scared that I won't be there to see her grow up, to watch her become the woman I know she's meant to be. I wish I could be the one to guide her through everything, but I have to trust that she'll find her own way. She's strong, stronger than I ever was. I just hope she knows how much I love her. Asterisk. Tears blurred Ariana's vision as she read the words her mother had written years ago. The secret, the fear, the love, it all made sense now. Her mother had known, had been fighting a battle with time, and she had tried so hard to shield Ariana from the harsh truth. Ariana closed the journal slowly, her fingers trembling. The weight of the realization hung heavily in the air. Her mother hadn't just passed away, she had left with so many unfinished words, so many unspoken goodbyes. But the most important thing was clear, her mother had loved her deeply, had always believed in her, and had wanted nothing more than for her to find her strength. Ariana sat quietly for a long time, letting the emotions wash over her. The loss was still there, sharp and painful, but now, there was also a sense of peace. Her mother's love wasn't gone. It was in every note she played, in every step she took, in every choice she made to keep going despite the odds. Her mother had given her everything she needed to succeed, not just as a musician, but as a person. She didn't need to keep running from the past. It was part of her, woven into her very being. The love and wisdom her mother had shared with her would always guide her, even in her absence. With newfound clarity, Ariana stood up, walked over to her piano, and sat down. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play a soft, melodic tune, a tribute to the woman who had shaped her, who had given her the courage to face her fears. As the music filled the room, Ariana knew that this was only the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and struggle, but now, with the truth of her mother's love surrounding her, she felt ready to take them on. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength her mother had always believed she had within her. And for the first time in a long time, Ariana felt a deep sense of peace, a sense of belonging, not just to herself, but to the legacy of love and music that her mother had left behind. The weeks following Ariana's discovery of her mother's journals were marked by a sense of clarity. She had confronted her past in a way that was both painful and healing, and now, with that weight lifted, she felt like a new chapter of her life was about to begin. The sadness from her mother's death would always be a part of her, but it was no longer the defining force in her life. She had learned to channel that pain into her music, her passion, and, more importantly, into her future. It was late afternoon when Ariana sat at her piano once more, her fingers moving gently over the keys. The melody was a mixture of hope and reflection, a tribute to the woman who had given her everything. She was playing Clair de Lune once again, but this time, there was no fear, no anxiety about making mistakes. She let the music flow, each note an affirmation of her journey, each chord a reminder of the strength she had inside her. As she played, her phone buzzed on the nearby table, interrupting the soft rhythm of the room. Ariana stopped mid-song, her heart skipping a beat as she picked it up. It was a text from Emma. "Hey, I've been thinking about you. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? I've got some news I want to share." Ariana smiled, grateful for her friend's constant support. It had been a while since they'd hung out just the two of them, and she was excited to catch up. "Sure, sounds great. See you at 11. Perfect. Can't wait." The next morning, Ariana met Emma at their favorite local cafe, a cozy little spot with mismatched furniture and an atmosphere that made you feel right at home. Ariana spotted Emma right away, waving from a table near the window. Her face lit up when she saw Ariana walk in, and she immediately stood to give her a hug. "You look so much more at peace," Emma said, her voice warm and full of affection as they sat down. I can tell there's been some kind of shift in you. Ariana smiled, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. Yeah, there's been a lot going on, but I think I'm finally starting to understand myself a little better. Emma nodded knowingly. I'm glad to hear that. You've been through so much, and I can see that you're stronger now. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. She leaned forward, excitement twinkling in her eyes. I've got big news. I've been working on something, and I think it's time you knew. Ariana's curiosity piqued. What's going on, Em? Emma took a deep breath, her expression serious for a moment before she smiled. I've been talking to a few people about your talent, Ariana. And there's a scholarship opportunity at the prestigious Northbrook Music Conservatory. They're offering a spot for one promising pianist, and I think you should apply. You've got the skill, and they would be crazy not to take you. Ariana froze for a second, unsure if she had heard Emma correctly. Wait, you're serious? The Northbrook Conservatory? The one that's been known for producing some of the best pianists in the world? Emma nodded, her smile unwavering. Yes, exactly. They've got a rigorous application process, but I've spoken to the admissions director, and he's really excited to see your work. He said it would be an incredible opportunity for you to get the kind of mentorship and training you deserve. Ariana's heart raced, her mind spinning with the possibilities. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, a chance to study at one of the best music schools in the country, to immerse herself in the art of piano and grow into the musician she had always hoped to become. But at the same time, there was fear, an overwhelming sense of doubt that crept into her thoughts. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the competition was too fierce? What if the rejection felt like too much to bear? Ariana, I know you're scared, Emma continued, sensing her hesitation. But you don't have to do this alone. I'll be right there with you, every step of the way. This is your chance, and I truly believe you have everything it takes to make it. Ariana took a deep breath and looked down at her hands, the same hands that had played countless hours at the piano, the same hands that had poured out her heart in every note. She thought about everything she had gone through, the pain of losing her mother, the struggle with self-doubt, the mistakes, the triumphs. She had faced so many obstacles, but here she was, standing stronger than ever. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe this was the moment to embrace the next step, to take that leap of faith. I'll do it, Ariana said, the words coming out more confidently than she had expected. I'm going to apply. I'm going to give it everything I've got. Emma's face lit up with joy. I knew you'd say that. You're going to crush it, Ariana. I'm so proud of you. As they continued to chat, Ariana couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. She was nervous, of course, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond her fears. She was ready for this next chapter, for the challenge that lay ahead. The next few weeks flew by as Ariana worked tirelessly on her application. She practiced her pieces with renewed determination, pouring her heart into every note. She revisited the pieces she had played at the competition, trying to perfect every detail. It wasn't about perfection, she told herself, but about giving her best effort and being proud of the work she was doing. It was hard, especially with the looming pressure of submitting her application. There were moments when doubt crept in again, when she questioned whether she was truly good enough. But she reminded herself that she had already overcome so much, losing her mother, facing the challenges of school and competition, finding the courage to keep going. If she could survive all of that, she could certainly face this. And so, with Emma's support and the love of her mother always in her heart, Ariana poured everything she had into her final audition tape. She submitted it, knowing that regardless of the outcome, she had already taken an important step towards something greater. Weeks passed, and the waiting was excruciating. Ariana focused on her music, kept practicing, and stayed grounded in the journey. But every time she checked her phone, her heart skipped a beat. The notification she had been waiting for came unexpectedly one rainy afternoon. The subject line read, Northbrook Music Conservatory, your application status. With trembling hands, Ariana opened the email. Her eyes scanned the words, her heart pounding in her chest as she read the acceptance letter, confirming that she had been selected for an audition. The next step had officially begun. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the final lines. We were incredibly impressed with your audition and are excited to offer you the chance to audition for a spot in our next class. Congratulations on making it this far, Ariana. We look forward to seeing you at Northbrook. She had done it. She had taken the next step, and the door to her dreams had just swung wide open. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The day had arrived. Ariana stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of her coat. She had spent the past few weeks preparing for this moment, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Everything had led up to this, the application, the practice, the late-night rehearsals, the uncertainty, and the hope. She had poured her heart and soul into every note, and now it was time to see if that would be enough. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence in the room. It was a message from Emma. You've got this, Ariana. Just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing them who you are. I'm so proud of you. Ariana smiled at the text, feeling the familiar warmth of her friend's support. It was just what she needed to hear. She wasn't going into this audition as a perfect pianist, she realized. She was going in as herself, flawed, but determined, passionate, and ready to face whatever came next. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her bag and walked out of the room, ready for the challenge ahead. The Northbrook Music Conservatory was located in a beautiful old building, its architecture a perfect blend of classic and modern. The conservatory was known for nurturing the next generation of talented musicians, and as Ariana stepped through the front doors, she felt a sense of awe mixed with nervousness. The hallways were lined with photos of famous alumni, names she recognized, legends in the world of music. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet as she made her way toward the audition room. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and her nerves threatened to get the best of her. But she reminded herself, this was the opportunity she had worked for. It was her chance to show the world who she was as a pianist, as an artist. She had already proven to herself that she could do it. When she entered the audition room, she was greeted by a group of faculty members seated behind a long table. The head of the department, a tall man with graying hair and sharp features, stood and smiled as she walked in. His presence was commanding, but his eyes held a kindness that made Ariana feel just a little bit less intimidated. Good morning, Ariana, he said, extending a hand. We're glad to have you here today. Are you ready? Ariana nodded, taking a deep breath before shaking his hand. Yes, thank you for this opportunity. He motioned toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. The floor is yours. Please begin whenever you're ready. As she made her way to the piano, the weight of the room seemed to press down on her. She could feel the eyes of the faculty members on her, the anticipation hanging in the air. But she didn't let it overwhelm her. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself, focusing on the music. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to express herself. She sat at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. The first note was simple, but it resonated deeply within her. She had chosen a piece she knew well, one that had always brought her a sense of peace and clarity, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It was a piece that had helped her through some of her toughest moments, and it felt right for this pivotal moment in her life. As she began to play, the sound filled the room, flowing from her fingertips with ease. The music was like a conversation between her heart and the piano, a delicate, yet powerful dialogue. She allowed herself to get lost in the music, to forget about the nerves, to forget about the people watching her. It was just her and the piano. The notes cascaded through the room, each one carrying the weight of her emotions, her past, and her hopes for the future. She wasn't just playing notes, she was telling a story. She was sharing her journey, the pain, the growth, and the triumphs. She played with passion, with intensity, but also with a quiet vulnerability that made the piece feel intimate, as though she were sharing a secret with the world. Time seemed to stretch as she played, the music unfolding in front of her. She lost track of everything around her, the people, the room, the ticking clock. It was just the music. When she finished the last note, she opened her eyes, unsure of what to expect. The room was silent, and for a moment, she worried that perhaps she had not done enough. But then, slowly, one of the faculty members, a woman with short, dark hair, clapped, followed by the others. Ariana's heart skipped a beat as she looked around the room, unsure if this was a polite gesture or genuine appreciation. The head of the department stood up, his face thoughtful. "Ariana, that was a beautiful performance. You have a natural gift. Your playing shows a depth of emotion and maturity that we rarely see in young musicians. Your technical skill is impressive, but it's your ability to convey emotion through your music that sets you apart." Ariana's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected such a strong reaction, and the praise felt surreal. She had been so focused on doing her best that she hadn't allowed herself to hope for this kind of validation. The man continued, "I'd like to hear another piece. Something a little different, perhaps a more lively piece to show us your range as a performer." Ariana nodded, grateful for the opportunity to showcase more of her skills. She chose a challenging piece she had been working on for months, Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It was fast, intricate, and required every ounce of her concentration. She took a moment to compose herself, letting the adrenaline from the first performance settle, before she began again. As she played the second piece, the energy in the room shifted. The pace of the music was faster, more intense, and Ariana poured herself into it with everything she had. She felt the piece come to life under her fingers, the intricate melodies and rapid runs almost like a conversation between her and the piano. She was moving now, the music pushing her forward, urging her to take risks. When she finished, she looked up at the panel, her hands trembling from the intensity of the performance. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, and her stomach twisted with nerves. Finally, the head of the department spoke. "Ariana, that was exceptional. You have the technical prowess and the emotional depth we look for in our students. I think you're exactly what Northbrook is looking for." Ariana's heart soared. She had done it. She had made it through the audition, and the feedback was more than she could have ever hoped for. The sense of relief that washed over her was almost overwhelming. She had worked so hard for this moment, and now, she could finally see the fruits of her labor. "I want to thank you for coming today," the head of the department continued. "You've shown us your heart and your skill. We will be in touch soon with the results, but I can say with confidence that you've impressed all of us." As she stood to leave, Ariana felt a rush of emotions. The hard work, the struggles, the doubts, all of it had led to this. No matter what happened next, she had proven to herself that she could rise to any challenge. She left the room with a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The audition was over, but this was just the beginning. Whatever the outcome, she knew she had already won something far more important, her belief in herself. The days after the audition were a strange mix of hope and dread. Ariana found herself caught in a state of limbo, where time seemed to stretch on forever, but at the same time, she could never quite escape the anxious thoughts racing through her mind. Every time her phone buzzed, she'd jump, half expecting an email from Northbrook. But the days passed, and no news came. Ariana tried to focus on other things, school, her music, the small moments of peace that had become more frequent in her life, but it wasn't enough to silence the voice of doubt that lingered in the back of her mind. What if they didn't accept her? What if they didn't think she was good enough? The thought gnawed at her, and each passing day made the uncertainty feel heavier. She found herself returning to the piano more often, as if the music could drown out the silence that seemed to stretch around her. But even as her fingers danced over the keys, the unease remained. The weight of waiting pressed on her chest, like a storm just on the horizon. One evening, after another long practice session, Ariana sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. It was nearly midnight. The anxiety she had been trying to suppress all day was starting to seep out. She couldn't take the not knowing anymore. Without thinking, she opened her email inbox and scrolled through the messages, hoping for a sign. Then, she saw it. The subject line read, "Northbrook Music Conservatory, your application status." Her hands trembled as she clicked on the message, her heart pounding in her chest. The words on the screen blurred for a moment, and she had to blink several times before they became clear. Dear Ariana, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a finalist for a spot in the Northbrook Music Conservatory. We were impressed by your technical skill, your passion for music, and your unique artistry. We would like to invite you to a final audition at our campus. Ariana read the email twice, unable to process the words at first. Finalist. She was a finalist. She had made it to the next round, but there was still another hurdle to cross. She wasn't in yet. She wasn't finished. Her excitement was tempered by a fresh wave of fear. This was it, the final audition. If she wanted to be accepted into Northbrook, she would have to give everything she had, all over again. There was no room for failure, no room for second-guessing. As she sat there, staring at the screen, she felt the weight of her dreams pressing down on her. She thought about all the people who had believed in her, her mother, Emma, and even the faculty at the audition who had shown her so much support. Could she really do this? The question lingered in the back of her mind, but she refused to give it power. She had come too far. She couldn't let this moment slip through her fingers. The next morning, Ariana woke up with a newfound sense of determination. She had only a few weeks to prepare for the final audition, and she was going to make the most of every single day. She set aside her doubts, focusing instead on the music, on what she could control. The days that followed were a blur of practice and discipline. Ariana pushed herself harder than ever, determined to leave no room for error. But even as she rehearsed, she could feel the pressure building. It wasn't just about playing the right notes, it was about proving to herself, and to the world, that she was ready for this. One evening, after a particularly grueling practice session, Ariana collapsed onto the couch in her living room, exhausted. Her fingers ached, and her mind was foggy with fatigue. She had been practicing the same piece for hours, trying to perfect every single note. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet the constant hum of anxiety that had become her companion over the last few weeks. It was then that her phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. Ariana glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw that it was Emma. "Hey," Ariana said, trying to keep the fatigue out of her voice. "Hey, how's it going? You're still practicing, right?" Emma's voice was light and upbeat, a contrast to the heaviness Ariana had been feeling lately. "I'm trying. It's been hard," Ariana admitted, letting out a tired sigh. "I've been working on the same piece over and over, and it's just not clicking the way I want it to." Emma was quiet for a moment, and Ariana could almost hear her thinking. "Ariana, you've come so far. Do you realize that? You're at the final audition stage for Northbrook. That's huge. You've already proven that you've got what it takes. And if this piece isn't working out, it's okay. You're allowed to have moments where things don't go perfectly. That doesn't take away from everything you've accomplished." Ariana's eyes filled with tears at her friend's words. It was exactly what she needed to hear. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Emma. I feel like I can't stop doubting myself. What if I'm not good enough?" "You're good enough, Ariana. You are more than good enough. You've already shown that you can face any challenge, and this audition is just another step. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. And no matter what, you've already made your mark." Ariana sat in silence for a moment, letting Emma's words sink in. It was hard to believe it, but her friend was right. She had already proven so much to herself and to others. And maybe it was time to stop worrying about perfection and start trusting that the music would speak for itself. "You're right," Ariana said finally, her voice steadier. "I can do this." "Of course you can. And remember, I'm here for you. You're not alone in this." The conversation lifted Ariana's spirits, and for the first time in days, she felt the weight of doubt begin to lift. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real, being true to herself and the music. She had done everything she could to prepare, and now all she could do was trust in her abilities and give it her all. The final audition was only a few weeks away. Ariana knew she had more work to do, but she was ready. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, learned to embrace her imperfections, and come to terms with her past. She had nothing left to prove except to herself, and that was all that mattered. The days leading up to the final audition felt like a blur. Every waking moment seemed consumed by the relentless drive to prepare, to practice, to perfect. But despite the exhaustion that seemed to follow her everywhere, Ariana found herself pushing through, each day bringing her closer to the moment she had worked so hard for. She could feel the pressure mounting, but she didn't let it break her. The past weeks had taught her to face fear, to confront her doubts, and most importantly, to trust in her own abilities. As the day of the final audition approached, Ariana made her way to the Northbrook Music Conservatory once again. This time, though, there was a different energy in the air. The nerves were sharper, the anticipation more tangible. Her heart beat a little faster as she entered the familiar, grand lobby, where students and staff bustled around her, their voices echoing in the marble hallways. Ariana had been here before, but today was different. She was no longer just an observer, today, she was fighting for a place in this world. The conservatory was buzzing with activity, as other hopeful musicians milled about, some in their best performance attire, others nervously pacing or practicing their pieces. Ariana felt a mixture of excitement and fear swirling inside her. She knew that the odds were slim, so many talented musicians were vying for the same spot. But she had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. She checked in at the front desk and was handed a schedule. Her time was coming up soon. She wandered toward the audition room, her mind running over the piece she would be playing, Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It was one of the most difficult pieces she had ever attempted, but there was a fire in her that wouldn't let her back down. It was her moment to prove that she was more than just a pianist. She was an artist, and this was her time to show the world who she really was. The room was quiet when Ariana entered. The panel of judges, a group of esteemed musicians and faculty members, sat behind a long table, their eyes scanning the sheet music in front of them, giving little indication of how they might react. They looked calm, collected, as if they had seen this all before. But Ariana could feel the weight of their gaze. She wasn't just another auditionee. She was here to make them see her, to make them hear her. The head of the department, who had greeted her last time, nodded toward her, gesturing for her to begin. His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made Ariana believe that they were all watching, waiting for her to begin. Ariana took a deep breath and walked over to the grand piano. Her fingers trembled as she placed them on the keys, but she forced herself to steady her hands. This was it. There would be no second chances. She closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the music, letting it wash over her. The first note of the Ballade No. 1 rang out in the room, and Ariana's body relaxed slightly as the familiar melody took shape under her fingertips. The room seemed to fade away. There was only the music now. Only the notes, the chords, the rhythm. She had played this piece so many times in the past weeks, but today, it felt different. It felt like her heart was woven into every sound, every crescendo, every delicate trill. The tension in the room, the heavy expectations, it all melted away. It was just her and the piano. The piece built in intensity, moving from the gentle and lyrical opening to the dramatic, thunderous passages that followed. Ariana's fingers flew across the keys, each note ringing clear and pure. She could feel her energy rising with the music. She could hear the passion in her playing, the way the music told her story, told the story of everything she had been through to get to this moment. As the piece reached its climax, Ariana pushed herself harder. Her heart raced, her muscles ached, but she didn't stop. This was where she had to show them what she was capable of. She wasn't just playing a piano, she was giving everything she had, pouring every ounce of herself into the music. Every note was a part of her soul. And then, just as the piece reached its final, breathtaking conclusion, Ariana played the last note, letting it linger in the air. She let the silence fill the room for a moment before slowly opening her eyes. Her hands were shaking, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the performance. She had done it. She had given it all. For a long moment, there was only silence. The panel of judges didn't speak, and Ariana's heart seemed to stop beating as she waited for them to respond. She could feel the tension building, each second stretching longer than the last. She was acutely aware of every inch of her body, the tremble in her hands, the sweat on her brow. And then, finally, the head of the department leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Ariana," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. That was remarkable. Her heart soared, but she couldn't let herself get ahead of the moment. She needed to hear more. She needed to know what came next. The head of the department continued. "You played with a depth of emotion that is rare. You didn't just play the notes, you lived them. We can hear your story, your journey, in every note. Your technical skill is exemplary, but it's your ability to convey emotion through your music that truly sets you apart." Ariana felt a lump form in her throat. She had worked so hard for this. Every late night, every sacrifice, it had all been worth it to hear these words. "Thank you," Ariana whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Another judge, a woman with short dark hair, smiled and nodded. "We want to offer you a spot in the conservatory, Ariana. We believe you have the potential to become an extraordinary musician. We'd be honored to have you join us." Ariana's mind went blank. She had heard the words, but it took a moment for them to truly sink in. She blinked, as though waking from a dream. "Wait. What?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "You've been accepted," the head of the department said again, this time with a smile that made Ariana's heart flutter. "Congratulations." Ariana's world tilted, her heart racing with disbelief and joy. She had done it. She had made it. Tears pricked her eyes, but she fought them back, knowing that this was just the beginning of her journey. The hard work, the sacrifices, the struggles, it had all led her here. And now, she was a part of something bigger, something she had always dreamed of. She stood up, overwhelmed, and said the words that had been sitting in her chest for so long, "Thank you. Thank you so much. I won't let you down." As she left the room, Ariana felt a rush of emotions. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She was no longer just fighting to survive. She was fighting for her future, and the world was finally opening up to her. She had done it. She had won. And this was only the beginning. The days after the final audition were a whirlwind. Ariana could hardly believe it. She had spent so many years dreaming of this moment, of being accepted into the prestigious Northbrook Music Conservatory, and now, it was a reality. The acceptance letter was on her desk, framed by a golden border of possibilities. But with this achievement came a new reality. The future was waiting for her, and it was filled with both promise and uncertainty. In the days following the audition, Ariana allowed herself to savor the victory. She had done it. She had proven to herself that all the hours of practice, all the sacrifices, all the self-doubt had been worth it. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel proud, not in the way of showing off to others, but proud in the quietest, most meaningful sense of the word. She had fought her way to this point. Her mother, when she heard the news, was overjoyed. Mrs. Brooks could hardly stop smiling as she hugged her daughter, tears of joy in her eyes. "You did it, baby. You really did it." The sense of pride and relief in her mother's voice was enough to make Ariana feel as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. But even as the joy and excitement surged through her, she knew there was more work ahead. The next step was clear: packing, preparing, and moving to a new city. Northbrook was located in a bustling metropolis far from their quiet hometown, and it would be the first time Ariana would live away from home. The idea of leaving behind the comfort of her neighborhood, the familiar faces, the old piano in the corner of her room, it felt both thrilling and terrifying. She was stepping into the unknown, and though she had longed for this new chapter, a part of her wondered if she was truly ready for the challenges it would bring. As the days ticked by, Ariana's thoughts turned inward. She thought about her past, about her childhood, the struggles, the relentless pressure to prove herself. She thought about the moments when she had doubted her worth, when the world had seemed too harsh, too unforgiving. And then she thought about all the people who had stood by her, her mother, Emma, and the music teachers who had encouraged her every step of the way. She would miss home, of course. She would miss the comfort of knowing where everything was, the familiarity of the streets she had grown up on. But she knew that this was the next step in her journey. She was no longer that shy, uncertain girl who had doubted herself. She had come so far, further than she had ever thought possible, and now she was about to enter a world where her dreams could finally take flight. The packing process itself was a blur. There were so many things to sort through: old books, music sheets, clothes, but Ariana found herself packing with a strange sense of purpose. Every item she carefully placed into boxes felt like it had a story, a memory, a lesson attached to it. It wasn't just the things she had accumulated over the years, it was the person she had become. On the day of her departure, Mrs. Brooks drove Ariana to the train station. The car was filled with the hum of a nervous energy that neither of them could shake. Ariana glanced at her mother, who was smiling, but Ariana could see the sadness in her eyes. It was the look of a mother who knew her daughter was about to take a giant step into the world. It was the look of pride, but also of letting go. "Ariana, I know you're going to do amazing things," her mother said, voice thick with emotion. "I've always known that you were destined for greatness. I just want you to remember one thing: don't forget where you came from. Don't forget the people who love you, and don't forget that you can always come home if you need to." "I won't forget, Mom," Ariana said softly, her voice catching in her throat. "I promise." The train ride to Northbrook was a quiet one. Ariana sat by the window, watching the scenery pass by, her thoughts swirling. She tried to distract herself with music, but her mind kept drifting back to the unfamiliarity of it all. It was the beginning of a new life, yes, but it was also the end of an era. She was leaving behind the girl she had been, her teenage self, unsure and still growing, and stepping into something completely new. As the train approached the city, Ariana felt her excitement grow. Northbrook was everything she had imagined: tall skyscrapers, busy streets, the hum of city life all around her. It was nothing like the sleepy town she had come from. It was a place filled with opportunity, with people who shared her passions, her dreams. It was the place where she could finally thrive. She arrived at her new apartment late in the afternoon, tired but exhilarated. The apartment was small but cozy, located in a quiet corner of the city. It was hers to make her own, and as she unpacked her things and set up her piano, Ariana felt a sense of belonging settling in. She was here. This was where her dreams would come to life. The first few days were a blur of orientation sessions, meeting new people, and finding her way around the campus. Northbrook was intimidating: its grandeur, the level of talent that surrounded her, the constant hum of competition. But Ariana knew that she had earned her place here. She wasn't just a finalist anymore. She was a part of this world, and she had every right to be. On the first day of classes, Ariana walked into the music building, heart racing with anticipation. Her new professors were brilliant, some of them world-renowned musicians, and the students were all incredibly talented. She felt a mix of awe and intimidation as she entered her first class. The standard of excellence here was unlike anything she had experienced before. But Ariana knew that she couldn't let fear rule her. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. She had something to prove, not to the world, not to anyone else, but to herself. She belonged here. As she sat down at the grand piano in one of the practice rooms, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence wash over her. The sound of her fingers touching the keys felt like the beginning of everything. It was the start of a new journey. And Ariana was ready for it. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was her time. She had earned it, and she wasn't about to let anything stop her now. As the first few weeks at Northbrook Music Conservatory flew by, Ariana's sense of awe was replaced by a growing sense of responsibility. The days were long, filled with grueling practice sessions, theory classes, and rehearsals that often went late into the evening. While she had always considered herself dedicated to her craft, the demands of the conservatory were unlike anything she had ever experienced. There were no shortcuts here, no easy answers. Everyone around her was an expert, pushing their own limits, striving for perfection, and Ariana knew she had to keep up. Her professors were strict. Each one had a different teaching style, but they all shared the same high expectations. Professor Lancaster, her piano instructor, was particularly tough. He would watch her play with a quiet, intense focus, and after each piece, he would dissect every note, every subtle inflection in the music, as if searching for any mistake, no matter how small. Ariana had always been used to the rigorous training back home, but this was different. Lancaster had a way of making her feel as if the entire weight of her performance rested on her shoulders. "You have the talent," he would say, his voice stern yet thoughtful. "But talent alone is not enough. You must learn discipline, precision. Your technique is good, but you are still relying too much on emotion. That's not enough. Music is a conversation between you and the instrument. Do not let your feelings get in the way." Ariana would nod, biting back the frustration that built up inside her. She knew he was right, but it was hard to hear. She had always expressed herself through her music, letting her emotions guide her fingers, and the thought of restraining that natural instinct felt like losing a part of herself. The pressure mounted. Every day, it seemed, her classmates were better, faster, more technically perfect. In the practice rooms, the sounds of their flawless performances echoed through the building, only serving to remind Ariana of how much more she needed to improve. She spent hours perfecting every piece, focusing on technique, trying to meet the impossibly high standards set by her professors and peers. But it never seemed like enough. Every time she thought she had mastered a piece, there was another layer to uncover, another detail to perfect. It felt like an endless cycle of striving for something just beyond her reach. Ariana found herself waking up earlier and going to bed later, squeezing every possible minute out of the day to work on her craft. She had no choice, she couldn't afford to fall behind. Yet, no matter how much she practiced, there were days when she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of expectations. She had come to Northbrook to prove herself, but now, she was starting to wonder if she had the strength to keep going. It was one late evening in the practice room when it all came to a head. Ariana was working on Chopin's Ballade No. 1 again, her audition piece. She had played it so many times now, but tonight, something felt off. She played through the opening measures, but the notes didn't feel right. They were flat, mechanical. There was no soul in the music, no passion, no life. Her hands trembled as she played, and the frustration began to mount. Her mind raced. Why can't I do this? Why is it so hard? She took a deep breath and tried again, but the results were the same. Her fingers hit the wrong notes, her timing was off, and soon, she found herself slamming her hands down on the keyboard in frustration. She had always prided herself on her ability to overcome obstacles, but now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like giving up. The music seemed impossible, and so did her future. For a moment, she let herself sit in the silence of the room, her head in her hands. She had never felt so alone. Every moment of doubt, every fear, seemed to flood over her. It wasn't just about the music, it was about her place in this world. The conservatory was full of brilliant minds, talented musicians, and Ariana wondered if she had made a mistake. What if I'm not cut out for this? What if I fail? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Emma. "Hey, just checking in. How's everything going?" Ariana stared at the message for a long moment. She thought about replying with a simple, "Fine," but the truth felt much more complicated than that. Instead, she typed out the words that had been sitting in her chest for days. "I don't know if I can do this. It's harder than I thought. Everyone here is so much better than me. What if I'm not good enough?" She hit send, her hands still trembling. Within seconds, Emma replied. "Hey, don't even think like that. You've made it this far because you're good enough. You've always been good enough. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, but don't let it stop you. You belong there, Ariana. I know it." Ariana read the message over and over. It was the encouragement she needed, the reminder that she wasn't alone. Emma was right, Ariana had worked too hard to get to this point to give up now. She might be struggling, but that didn't mean she had failed. Everyone at Northbrook had been through their own battles, their own moments of self-doubt. This was part of the journey. And she was going to make it. With renewed determination, Ariana wiped the tears from her eyes and stood up from the piano. She wasn't going to let the pressure break her. She wasn't going to let the expectations of others define her. She was going to keep going, keep fighting, keep playing. The next day, Ariana entered the practice room with a new sense of resolve. She knew there would be difficult days ahead, that the pressure would only get heavier, but she was ready. She was ready to face the challenges and grow stronger because of them. She had come too far to turn back now. Her fingers danced across the keys again, this time with a quiet strength. She wasn't perfect, and that was okay. She was learning, evolving, becoming the musician she was meant to be. And with every note, she felt herself getting closer to that goal. Ariana wasn't just playing the piano anymore. She was living the music. And she wasn't about to let anything, anyone, stand in her way. The days at Northbrook Music Conservatory continued to blur together in a constant whirl of lessons, practice sessions, and performances. Each day seemed to come with a new challenge, a new hurdle for Ariana to overcome. The competitive atmosphere of the conservatory was not just something she had heard about, it was something she could feel with every passing day. As the weeks wore on, Ariana's confidence was slowly but steadily being chipped away. Every time she walked into a practice room, she was met with the sound of flawless playing from the other students. Their skill and technical perfection seemed to highlight all the areas where she still struggled. It wasn't that Ariana wasn't talented, she was, but the level of excellence here felt like an impossible standard, one that she couldn't quite measure up to. Professor Lancaster continued to push her, but with each critique, it felt less like guidance and more like pressure. He no longer just corrected her mistakes. Now, he dissected every nuance, every phrasing, every subtlety, until Ariana felt like nothing she did was ever good enough. "You're still not connecting with the music the way I know you can," Professor Lancaster told her one afternoon, his voice cutting through her concentration. "You're thinking too much about the notes, Ariana. You're not feeling the piece." Ariana's hands froze on the keys. Her heart sank. She had been trying so hard, working tirelessly to get every note just right, every dynamic in place. But it felt like no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. She had always prided herself on her ability to express herself through music, but now it felt like that was being stripped away from her. She was caught in a constant struggle to meet expectations, both her own and others, and in doing so, she was losing sight of why she started playing in the first place. After that lesson, Ariana spent hours in the practice room, trying to connect with the music. She tried to let go of the technicalities, to forget about the notes and just play. But it didn't come easily. The pressure was suffocating. Every wrong note, every missed tempo felt like a failure, and soon, her frustration began to build again. By the end of the week, Ariana felt mentally and physically drained. Her fingers were sore from hours of practice, and the fatigue from not sleeping well weighed heavily on her body. She had barely eaten anything that day, too consumed with the need to get things perfect, too terrified of failing. She sat in her small apartment that evening, staring at her phone but not having the energy to reply to any messages. She didn't want to talk to anyone. She didn't want to face anyone. Her thoughts spiraled. The self-doubt had returned, louder and more persistent than ever before. What if I'm not cut out for this, she thought again, the question echoing in her mind. What if everyone here is right? What if I'm just not good enough? She looked at the acceptance letter she had framed on her desk. The words that had once filled her with joy now seemed like a reminder of how much she had to live up to. She had been so sure of herself when she had first received it, so confident that she belonged here. But now, it felt like an impossible dream. Is it too late to go home? She wondered. Is it too late to admit that I might not make it here? Her phone buzzed again, snapping her from her dark thoughts. It was a message from Emma. Hey, how are you doing? I haven't heard from you in a while. You okay? Ariana stared at the message for a long time. She wanted to tell Emma everything, the pressure, the stress, the constant feeling of not being good enough, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She didn't want to sound weak. She didn't want to admit that she was struggling. She didn't want to disappoint anyone. I'm fine. Just a little tired, I guess. I'll talk to you soon. She hit send and threw her phone on the bed. The truth was, she was far from fine. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically. But she didn't know how to explain that. She didn't even know how to explain it to herself. The next day, she dragged herself out of bed early for another round of practice. The fatigue in her bones made every step feel heavier, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. She needed to get it right. She walked into the practice room, her fingers cold and stiff. She glanced at the piano and then back at the sheet music in front of her. It was all so overwhelming, there were so many expectations, so many voices telling her what to do and how to play. And yet, in the midst of all that, she was beginning to lose her own voice. Ariana closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had to stop. She had to clear her mind. She couldn't play like this, lost, unsure, and drowning in expectations. As she sat there, she remembered her mother's words. Don't forget who you are. You're more than just a piano player. You're a person, with feelings, dreams, and a story to tell. Her mother had always told her that music wasn't just about technique or perfection, it was about telling a story. Music was an expression of life, of everything that made you who you were. It wasn't supposed to be just about following the rules, it was about breaking them, about finding something new in the space between the notes. Ariana opened her eyes and placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't focus on the perfection this time. She didn't think about the rules. She just let her fingers move, playing with the melody, feeling the weight of each note, the rise and fall of the music. It wasn't flawless, but it was real. The sound that came from the piano wasn't just a collection of notes. It was her. It was the girl who had fought to get here, the girl who had overcome the odds and had come to this place with a dream. For the first time in weeks, she felt at peace with her playing. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. When she finished, Ariana sat back, breathing heavily, a mixture of relief and clarity washing over her. This was what she had been missing. She wasn't going to be perfect, and that was okay. She didn't have to be flawless to be good enough. She just had to be herself. In that moment, Ariana made a vow to herself: she would keep fighting, but not for perfection. She would fight to stay true to herself, to remember the joy that music had always brought her. The road ahead was uncertain, but she would face it with her head held high, knowing that she was enough just as she was. She wasn't alone in this journey. And she didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be Ariana. The conservatory's winter recital was only days away, and Ariana could feel the weight of anticipation bearing down on her. Students practiced late into the night, their notes echoing through the corridors, each one striving to perfect their pieces, hoping for that moment when their efforts would finally pay off. Ariana had been preparing her piece for weeks, Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece she had grown to both love and fear. It had become more than just a piece of music. It had become a test of her resilience, her patience, and her ability to push through the challenges that had been thrown her way since she arrived at Northbrook. It was the piece that had both inspired her and pushed her to the brink. She had practiced it until her fingers bled, had run through every possible scenario in her mind. But now, with the recital looming just around the corner, the nerves were starting to creep in. For the past few days, her rehearsals had been tense. She'd start strong, her hands confident, her mind clear, but then, somewhere in the middle, the doubts would slip in. The self-criticism. The fear of not being good enough. And then, she'd stumble. Every mistake felt like a crack in her foundation, an indication that she might not be ready for the stage. What if I freeze up? What if I mess up in front of everyone? She tried to push those thoughts away, but they kept coming back, whispering in the back of her mind. She'd been here before, at the edge of breaking down, at the edge of quitting. But she couldn't quit now. Not after everything. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let fear take it all away. On the day of the recital, Ariana woke up earlier than usual, the cold winter air biting at her skin as she walked to the practice room. It was still dark outside, the sun not yet risen, but she knew she had to get in one last run-through before the performance. The empty hallways were eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of the day before. Ariana felt the silence settle around her, heavy and suffocating, like the calm before the storm. She entered the practice room and immediately sat at the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys, but for a moment, she just sat there, taking in the stillness. The piece that had been such a source of stress was now her only focus. She didn't need to be perfect, she just needed to play. Ariana began. Slowly at first, testing the waters, letting the music fill her. Her fingers found their way through the notes with ease. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about the next note or the next phrase. She was simply playing. And in that moment, the pressure lifted. The music flowed, and it felt like the weight of the world had been momentarily lifted off her shoulders. When she finished, she sat back and closed her eyes. She knew the real test was still ahead, the recital. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of confidence, a glimpse of what was possible if she could let go of the fear and just be. She was no longer playing for her professors, for her peers, or for anyone else. She was playing for herself. She had earned this moment. After a final deep breath, she stood up and left the practice room, her heart pounding. The recital was in just a few hours. She could already hear the buzz of excitement in the air as she walked past the auditorium, where students and faculty alike were preparing for the event. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her as she entered the dressing room, the pressure mounting once again. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress, Ariana could see the faint signs of fatigue in her eyes. But she didn't let it stop her. She was going to do this. She was going to perform, and no matter the outcome, she would give it everything she had. She wasn't going to let the fear of imperfection hold her back anymore. "Are you ready?" Emma's voice came from behind her, and Ariana turned to see her best friend standing in the doorway, her smile wide and encouraging. Ariana smiled back. "I think so." "You've got this," Emma said, her confidence contagious. "Just remember, this is your moment. It's all about you and the music. Just let go and have fun." Ariana nodded. "Thanks, Emma. I really need to hear that." Emma gave her a quick hug before leaving the room. Ariana took one last look at herself in the mirror and then walked toward the auditorium. The closer she got, the more her heart raced. She could hear the murmurs of the audience, the sound of instruments being tuned, the rustle of program pages being turned. It was time. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The bright lights above her were blinding, and for a moment, she could barely see the rows of people in the audience. She focused on the piano, the familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingertips. She took her seat, closed her eyes, and let the silence wrap around her. Then, without another thought, she began. The first few notes were shaky, as she expected. Her fingers trembled, and for a brief moment, her mind flashed back to all the doubts she had felt over the past few weeks. What if I fail? What if I forget the piece? But as she continued, something changed. She stopped worrying about the mistakes, stopped thinking about the audience, stopped worrying about what Professor Lancaster might think. She simply played. The music became a part of her, and the tension in her body began to ease. She lost herself in the rhythm of the piece, the sweep of the melody, the sharpness of the dissonant chords. With each passing measure, her confidence grew. By the time she reached the climax of the piece, her hands were steady, her heart was calm, and the music was flowing as effortlessly as if it had been written just for her. She was no longer playing the notes by rote. She was living the music. The audience was silent as she reached the final, delicate notes of the piece. The tension in the room seemed to build, the anticipation hanging in the air. When the last note rang out, it felt like time had stopped. Ariana held the final chord for a moment, allowing the sound to resonate, before slowly lifting her hands from the piano. The room was still. Then, after a beat that felt like an eternity, the applause came, loud, sincere, and filled with admiration. Ariana's heart raced, but it wasn't out of fear. It was out of relief, out of pride. She had done it. She had faced the stage, faced her fears, and come out on top. When she stood and took her bow, her eyes met the faces of her classmates, of her professors, and of her friends. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled, not because she had done it perfectly, but because she had done it her way. The pressure, the doubts, the struggles, all of it had led to this moment. And in that moment, Ariana realized that she wasn't just playing for the applause. She was playing for herself. And that was all she needed. The days after the recital felt like a blur. Ariana had been on a high, her performance having exceeded all her expectations. The applause still echoed in her mind, and the compliments from her peers and professors were a steady reminder that her hard work had finally paid off. For the first time since arriving at Northbrook, she allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished. But even with the success of her performance, the pressure wasn't entirely gone. The feeling of relief was brief. Before long, the next challenge loomed ahead. Despite the praise, Ariana couldn't shake the feeling of being unsettled. In the weeks following the recital, her thoughts began to wander back to the self-doubt she had battled for months. The constant comparison to her peers, the uncertainty that always seemed to linger in the back of her mind, was still there. The reality of life at Northbrook, a place of endless competition and rigorous demands, was beginning to settle in more than ever. Each day, Ariana passed her classmates, all of them with their own successes and failures, but always with the same relentless drive. There was no time to rest, no time to slow down. Everyone seemed to be moving forward, their achievements pushing them ever closer to their goals, while Ariana felt like she was running just to stay in the same place. It was during one of those long, exhausting practice sessions, that Professor Lancaster approached her after class. "Ariana," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You did well at the recital. Very well. But this isn't the end. It's only the beginning." Ariana's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of his words, the expectation that came with them. "I know," she said quietly, though her voice faltered. "I'm just trying to keep up with everything." "I know it's a lot," Lancaster said, offering a rare glimpse of sympathy. "But this is the reality of a place like this. You've made it here, but to stay here, to keep moving forward, you'll need to continue pushing yourself. You need to find your next step." The next step. Ariana could feel a sense of dread creeping in. She had already given so much of herself, her time, her energy. The pressure to keep proving herself was suffocating. She felt a pang of uncertainty. Was this really what she wanted? Or had she gotten lost in the whirlwind of expectations? As she walked back to her apartment that afternoon, Ariana couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had achieved so much, she had faced her fears and given an unforgettable performance, but it still didn't feel enough. It felt like there was always something else to prove, something she was falling short of. She spent that evening sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights below, letting her thoughts wander. She thought about home. About her mother, her friends, and the life she had left behind in New York. What had drawn her to Northbrook in the first place? The prestige? The challenge? Or had she come here to escape something? To prove something to herself? Suddenly, she realized that she had been running on empty for too long. She had been caught in the race, trying to keep up, trying to be perfect. But in doing so, she had lost sight of who she was and why she started playing music in the first place. She had to make a choice. The following day, Ariana decided to take a break. She didn't go to her morning practice session. Instead, she walked around the city, taking in the cold air and the sights around her. She stopped by a small cafe, ordered a cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching the people walk by. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to prove anything to anyone. The need to chase perfection, to outdo herself at every turn, had become an obsession, but it wasn't sustainable. Ariana had always known that music was about more than just the technical mastery, it was about expression, about heart. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that. She had gotten caught up in the race, in the idea of success, of achieving the highest possible level, without considering the cost. Now, she knew she needed to find balance. She had to take time to rediscover why she played music, why she loved it in the first place. It wasn't just about performing for an audience or getting recognition from her professors. It was about her connection with the music itself. Music was her way of expressing her emotions, her story. It had always been a part of who she was, and it was time to reconnect with that truth. Over the next few days, Ariana made a conscious effort to step away from the pressure. She still practiced, but it was no longer about perfection. She played for the joy of it, letting herself get lost in the music. She started exploring different genres, experimenting with improvisation, and revisiting some of the simpler pieces she had once loved. One evening, while practicing a piece by Debussy, Ariana realized something important: she didn't have to keep running. She didn't have to chase after some ideal version of success. She could be content with where she was, with what she had accomplished so far, and with the music she loved. She had always been so focused on the end result, but now, she understood that the journey, the process of growth, of finding her voice, was what truly mattered. Success didn't have to be defined by accolades or recognition. It could simply be the joy she found in playing, in creating something that was hers. With that realization, the tension in her body began to melt away. She still had a long way to go, but now, it didn't feel like a race. It felt like a path, one that she could walk at her own pace, one note at a time. It was a quiet, yet profound moment of clarity. Ariana knew she had made the right decision. The path ahead would not be easy, and she would still face challenges and setbacks, but she now understood that she didn't have to bear that weight alone. The music would always be there to guide her, to remind her of who she was and why she had started this journey in the first place. And for the first time in a long time, Ariana was okay with that. The pressure was still there, but it no longer defined her. What mattered was that she could keep going, keep growing, and keep playing for the love of the music. That, in itself, was enough. The rest would come when the time was right. The days following her moment of clarity were filled with change, not in the form of grand gestures or sudden decisions, but in small, subtle ways that shifted Ariana's approach to everything around her. She found herself approaching her studies with a renewed sense of purpose, but this time, the purpose was not about perfection or meeting others' expectations. It was about rediscovery. Rediscovering the joy of music, of life, and of being true to herself. Her relationship with the piano was different now. Instead of viewing it as a vehicle to compete or to prove herself, she saw it as a means of expression, a way to connect with her emotions and tell her story through sound. She started playing more freely, letting herself improvise in ways she never had before. No longer was she tied to the rigid structure of technical perfection. Now, it was about feeling the music, letting it take her to places where she could express the parts of herself that words couldn't reach. But the most significant change came in how she began to see her relationship with the people around her, especially with Professor Lancaster. During one of her lessons, as she played through an etude by Chopin, Ariana noticed something different in Lancaster's demeanor. His usual stern, impassive expression had softened, and his eyes, usually cold and critical, were filled with an almost reluctant admiration. When she finished, he didn't immediately offer his usual critique or advice. Instead, he simply sat there, listening. "Ariana," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I have to admit, your performance today was different. Not just technically, but emotionally. You found something that was missing before, something that I hadn't seen in you until now." She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I think I've found a way to play that feels true to me. I'm not as focused on getting it perfect anymore. I just want to play what I feel." Lancaster studied her for a moment, as if considering her words. "That's exactly what you needed to realize. You can't be someone you're not. Not in music, and not in life. You've come a long way, Ariana. I can see it now." He paused. "There's a rawness in your playing that shows you've grown. And that's something worth nurturing." Ariana felt a wave of relief wash over her. For so long, she had been caught in the constant battle for approval, for recognition. But in that moment, she understood that the most important approval she needed was her own. She no longer had to bend herself into the mold of someone else's expectations. She could trust herself to know what was best for her. Professor Lancaster continued, "I want to suggest something, Ariana. You've been working hard, but I think it's time you started collaborating with others. You're ready to push your boundaries even further." Ariana's heart fluttered. She had always been so focused on solo performances, on carving her own path, but the idea of working with others, of truly collaborating, excited her. "Collaboration?" she asked, intrigued. "Like chamber music?" "Exactly," Lancaster said. "I think you'll find that working with other musicians, seeing how they interpret music, will deepen your own understanding. It will challenge you in ways you haven't experienced yet." Ariana didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." That decision marked the beginning of a new chapter in her musical journey. She spent the following weeks practicing with fellow students, engaging in chamber music sessions, and learning how to listen, to both the music and the musicians around her. The dynamic of working together in a group, of blending her sound with others, taught her new ways to approach her music. It was no longer just about individual expression but about collective energy and communication through sound. But it wasn't just the music that was changing. Ariana's view of herself was evolving too. She started to understand that she didn't have to bear the weight of her dreams alone. She didn't have to keep proving herself over and over again to everyone around her. She had her own path, her own story, and it was enough. She trusted herself, and in doing so, she began to trust others more, especially her friends. Emma, who had been a constant support throughout this journey, noticed the shift in Ariana. One evening, they sat in the cafe on campus, the warmth of the tea cups in their hands offering a comforting contrast to the chill of the night air outside. "You're different," Emma said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "There's this piece about you now. Like you figured something out." Ariana smiled, feeling the truth of Emma's words. "I think I have. I've realized that I don't have to be perfect. I've been so caught up in trying to meet everyone else's expectations that I forgot about my own happiness. I'm starting to trust myself more." Emma nodded knowingly. "That's so important. I've seen how hard you've worked, how much you've pushed yourself. But it's also okay to step back and just be. And if you're happy, that's what matters most." Ariana looked out the window, watching as the first few flakes of snow began to fall. It felt like a new beginning. A fresh start. She had spent so long trying to outrun the pressure, but now, she understood that the only way forward was to embrace who she was, imperfections and all. And, as the days turned into weeks, Ariana continued to grow. She worked on her music with more joy, with more freedom. She found new ways to express herself, both through her piano and through her relationships. The challenges of Northbrook weren't over, but they no longer defined her. She was beginning to shape her own narrative, one note at a time. The winter recital was far behind her now, but it had marked a pivotal moment in her life, a moment where she chose to trust in her own voice. And with that trust, she knew that no matter what happened next, she would always have the music to guide her, and the strength to keep moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, Ariana felt ready for whatever came next. She was no longer running, no longer chasing some elusive version of success. She was simply living, playing, and trusting that the rest would unfold as it was meant to. This was her journey, and she was finally ready to embrace it, every step of the way. As the semester drew to a close, Northbrook Conservatory began to empty out as students scattered for winter break. The air had turned colder, the streets dusted with snow, and the campus, which had been so alive with energy, now seemed quieter, more contemplative. For Ariana, this time of year always brought with it a sense of reflection. It was the moment to look back on everything that had happened, to process all the changes, and to think about what lay ahead. She was no longer the same person who had walked onto campus months ago. Back then, she had been driven by fear, anxiety, and a need for validation. She had pushed herself to extremes, striving to meet the expectations of others while losing sight of what truly mattered to her. But now, she felt more grounded. More at peace with who she was, and, for the first time, excited about the future. It had taken a long time for Ariana to realize that success was not about perfection, nor was it about the praise of others. True success, she had come to understand, was about growth. About finding joy in the journey, not just the destination. And most importantly, it was about finding a balance between pushing yourself and letting go. Ariana sat in her room, her gaze falling on the piano in the corner. The instrument that had once felt like an obstacle, something she had to conquer, was now her trusted companion. Every note, every chord, felt like a conversation between herself and the music. She had rediscovered the love she had once felt for playing, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Emma. "Hey. Are you free? Let's grab some coffee before everyone leaves for the break." Ariana smiled. Emma had been there through every stage of her journey. From the late-night practice sessions to the moments of doubt, Emma had supported her without question, reminding her to stay grounded and focused on the things that truly mattered. Ariana quickly replied, "On my way." As she walked through the snow-covered campus, she thought about how much had changed. The competition, the pressure, it was all still there, but it no longer had the same grip on her. She had learned to take it in stride, knowing that the only thing she truly controlled was how she responded. And she was done responding to the expectations of others. She would live on her own terms now. When she arrived at the cafe, Emma was already sitting by the window, her usual bright smile lighting up the room. She waved enthusiastically when she saw Ariana. "You look different," Emma remarked as Ariana sat down. "I can see it in your eyes. It's like you've really found peace with everything." Ariana took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the coffee cup seep into her hands. "I think I have. It's been a long journey, but I'm finally feeling like I can just be. I don't have to be perfect, I don't have to meet anyone's expectations. I just have to play the music and enjoy the process. That's enough." Emma nodded, clearly proud of her friend. "I've seen you grow so much, Ariana. You've been through a lot this semester, but you've come out stronger. And you've helped me grow too, in more ways than you know." Ariana smiled, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. She hadn't realized how much her own journey had impacted those around her. It wasn't just about her growth, it had ripple effects, reaching the people she cared about, inspiring them to pursue their own paths with courage and authenticity. The two sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee, watching the snow continue to fall. There was a sense of calm that had settled between them, one that came from knowing they didn't need to rush through life. They could take it one step at a time, savoring each moment as it came. Eventually, Ariana broke the silence. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about next semester. I'm excited, but I'm also a little nervous." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Nervous? You, nervous?" Ariana laughed, shaking her head. "Yeah. I guess I've realized that the pressure is never really going to go away. But I'm not afraid of it anymore. I'm ready to take on whatever comes next. I've learned that it's okay to not have all the answers, to not be perfect. As long as I'm true to myself and stay focused on what matters, I know I can handle it." Emma grinned. "I love that. And hey, you've got this. You've already proven you're capable of way more than you think. Look at what you did at that recital. That was a huge moment for you. You've already exceeded so many expectations, especially your own." Ariana's heart swelled. She had been so focused on meeting other people's expectations that she had never fully realized how much she had accomplished on her own. The recital had been a turning point, not just in her musical journey but in her life as a whole. It had shown her that her worth wasn't tied to the opinions of others. It was inherent. "Thanks, Emma. Honestly, I couldn't have gotten here without you. You've been my rock, reminding me to stay grounded, to trust myself. I'm just grateful for you." Emma's face softened, and she reached out to squeeze Ariana's hand. "Always, Ariana. I'm so proud of you." As the conversation turned to lighter topics, Ariana's thoughts drifted to the future. She wasn't sure exactly what it held, but she no longer felt burdened by uncertainty. The road ahead might still be challenging, but she was ready to face it. She knew she didn't have to have everything figured out right now. Life wasn't a race, and it wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, about learning from the ups and downs, and about embracing each step of the journey. Ariana had come a long way since that first day at Northbrook. She had faced the pressure, the doubts, the criticism, and had come out the other side stronger, more confident, and more authentic. She had discovered a deep well of strength within herself, and she knew now that she could always tap into it. She wasn't just a student at a prestigious conservatory anymore. She was an artist, one who trusted her instincts, who played with passion, and who knew that her worth was not defined by anyone else but herself. As the snow continued to fall outside the cafe window, Ariana looked out at the world beyond and smiled. The future was hers to create, and she was ready to embrace it, one note at a time. And with that, Ariana knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?